The opinions expressed in the following sermon are the preacher's personal views and do not always reflect those of the North Platte Baptist Church. We only ask that you take Acts 17:11 to heart and search the Scriptures daily to see whether these things are so.
It's great to be in your church tonight. I appreciate the privilege to get to be here, and I do count it very much so a privilege. I want to ask you, if you would please, to open your Bibles to the book of 1 Samuel chapter 14. I know some of you invested your own personal time and energy and effort into the building of this building. I certainly want to congratulate you. You did a beautiful job, and I know many of you that did not necessarily work on the building. You helped to give towards it, and you prayed for it and so forth, and I appreciate the beautiful building. But of course, even though it is a beautiful building, and I take nothing away from that whatsoever, it's not the building, it's the people that are reached by the use of the building and the God that's glorified through it. So thank you for being here tonight. I'm grateful that you're here. Did I talk long enough for you to find 1 Samuel chapter 14? If you're in 1 Samuel chapter 14, that's where we're going to begin in just a moment. The nation of Israel had their first king. The first king, his name was Saul. And after Saul had been the king for about 2 years, he chose 3,000 men to go with him on a special mission. He actually took 2,000 of the 3,000 men and went to a place called Michmash. While he was in Michmash with 2,000 of the men, his son Jonathan, who was second in command in the army, took the other 1,000 men and went to a place called Gibeah. While Jonathan was there in Gibeah, the enemy, the Philistines, came into the land of Israel, and actually, if you can believe this, they actually set up a fort inside the land of Israel at a place called Geba. Well, Jonathan and his 1,000 men were not just going to sit back and let the enemy come in and set up a fort, so they left Gibeah and went down to Geba, and they attacked the enemy, the Philistines, and they defeated the enemy. So the enemy, the Philistines, left the land of Israel and went back to the land of the Philistines. Well, Saul wanted the whole nation to know about this great victory they had had, so he sent out what they called trumpeters. You know, back then they didn't have newspapers or televisions, and so if they wanted to get news out about something, you sent out these trumpeters, and they would go from village to village, and they would blow their trumpet. Everybody would stop what they were doing. They would come to the middle of the village, and the trumpeter would read a message from the king. Well, it took several days, maybe a few weeks, for these trumpeters to cover the whole nation of Israel. Well, while the news of this great victory was spreading across the land of Israel, the news of the great defeat was spreading across the land of the Philistines. So the Philistines began to gather an army, and they were going to come back and they were going to retaliate against the Israelites. The Bible said that the Philistines gathered 30,000 chariots. And I don't know how many men were in each chariot, whether it was 1 or 2 or 6 or 8, I don't know, but there was at least one in every chariot. So now the enemy has 30,000 mounted soldiers in iron chariots. The Bible said they also had 6,000 horsemen. We might call them cavalry. So now the enemy has 36,000 mounted soldiers. Well, these mounted soldiers in the chariots and on horses had to have support forces. The Bible calls them footmen. We might call them infantry. And the Bible said the footman was more than you could number, no more than you could number the grains of sand on the seashore. So now the enemy has this army, more than you can number. They're on the way back to retaliate. Saul and his 2,000 men in Michmash hear that they're coming and hear how many there are. And some of Saul's men started going AWOL. They deserted. The Bible said some of them hid in the caves, and some of them hid in the pits, and some of them hid in the rocks, and some in the high places, and some in the thickets or bushes. So Saul decided to take what he had left there in Michmash and go down to Gibeah, where Jonathan was, and combine his forces with Jonathan. And so he did. When he got there and combined his forces, he counted and found out that he had a total of 600 men left. Now remember, the enemy's got more than you can number. 36,000 mounted soldiers and more infantry than you can number. And so Saul and Jonathan are there in Gibeah with their 600 men. When the enemy get to Michmash, they figure out, of course, that Saul's not there anymore, so they set up their camp in Michmash. And then the Bible said that the enemy, the Philistines, sent out 3 groups of what the Bible calls spoilers. That's a military term in the Bible that in this particular place refers to a group of men who have been specially trained to attack. We might call them commandos. And so the Bible said that these spoilers came down from Michmash to Gibeah. One group came from this direction, and one group came from this direction, and one group came from this direction. So now the enemy has Saul and Jonathan and their 600 men sort of semicircle surrounded. So Saul decides to check with his men to see how many weapons they have ready to fight. And he finds out that they have 2 weapons. Not 2 weapons per man. 2 weapons. Saul has a sword and Jonathan has a sword, and nobody else in the Israeli army has a sword, a spear, a bow and arrow, a battle axe, a shield, a buckler, nothing with which to fight. Well, there's only one way to get out of Gibeah. There's a pass that goes up through the mountains behind Gibeah, and the enemy figured out that that was the only way to get out of Gibeah. So they sent out a 4th group called a garrison. A garrison is another military term. This time it refers to a group of men who have been specially trained to defend a certain spot. So the enemy goes around behind Gibeah and they set up their garrison. We might call it a roadblock in the middle of the pass. So now the enemy has Saul and Jonathan, their 600 men with their 2 weapons, completely surrounded. And the Bible said that Saul was in the uttermost part of the camp in Gibeah, under the shade of a pomegranate tree. You know what he was doing? He was discouraged. So he's laying down on the ground underneath this pomegranate tree with his soldiers between him and the enemy, as far away from the enemy as he could get. And right there is where we pick up the story. So if you'll look in chapter 14, 1 Samuel chapter 14, we're going to read verse 6. Verse 6 says, "And Jonathan said to the young man that bare his armor, Come and let us go over unto the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us. For there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few." And let's pray. Father, I pray tonight that you'll bless during this service, during the reading of the Word of God, during the preaching. I pray tonight that you'll help every one of us to listen exactly to what the Spirit has for us individually. In Christ's name, amen. Jonathan went on to say to the young man that was bearing his armor, he said to the young man, he said, "The 2 of us, me and you, we're going to leave the camp here in Gibeah, and we're going to go across the valley to where the enemy are." And he said, we're going to show ourselves to the enemy. He said, if the enemy says, stay there, we're coming to where you are, that's a sign that God's not in this idea. And I don't know about you, but I'm out of here. He said, but if the enemy says, come up here to where we are, then that's a sign that God is in this idea. And guess what? You and I, just the 2 of us, we're going into the enemy camp. So they left the camp there in Gibeah, and the Bible said at the edge of the camp there was a sharp rock, or we might call it a steep rock or a cliff. And the Bible said that they went down the sharp rock and across the valley, and when they got to the other side of the valley, there was another sharp rock or a steep rock or a cliff, and the enemy were up on the top of the cliff. And so Jonathan and the armor bearer stopped there at the bottom of the cliff, and they just stood there in the broad daylight, right out in the wide open, and waited for the enemy to see them. And sure enough, it wasn't long, and 2 of the enemy soldiers saw them down there. And one of the soldiers came out to the edge of the cliff, and he shouted down and said, "Come up here, and we'll show you a thing." You remember when you were a little kid on the playground at school? and somebody smarted off to you on the other side of the playground and you said, come over here, buddy, and I'll show you a thing or two? You didn't know you were quoting the Bible, did you? But that's exactly what they said. Come up here and we'll show you a thing. And so the Bible said the rock was so steep that they had to climb up on their hands and feet. And when they got to the top, the Bible uses the phrase, there was a clearing about a half acre. Oh, about the size of your parking lot out there. And in that half acre, there were 20 enemy soldiers. Well, Jonathan took his one sword and began to fight with a couple of those soldiers. He probably killed one of them, maybe wounded the other one. His armor bearer picked up the dead man's sword and finished off the wounded man. And by that time, Jonathan had probably wounded a couple of more, and the armor bearer finished them off. And the first thing you know, between the two of them, Jonathan and the armor bearer, they killed all 20 of the enemy soldiers. Well, word got back to the enemy camp that there's a couple of maniacs out there, and they're killing everybody. And the Bible said when they heard that the enemy soldiers began to tremble. Now remember, there were more of them than you could number, no more than you could number the grains of sand on the seashore. And when that many men began to tremble, the earth, the Bible uses the phrase, the earth began to quake. Have you ever been standing next to a railroad track when a train came by, going kind of slow, and you could literally feel the ground quaking underneath your feet? Well, that's what happened. But several years ago, my family and I were on vacation. We went out west. We love going out west. And on the way back, we stopped at a place called Custer State Park. It's a big place. It's 17,000 acres. And the reason we stopped there was somebody had told us that the largest herd of buffalo left in America was in Custer State Park. And so we wanted to see this buffalo. So we got us a cabin and we stayed there 3 days. And for 3 days, I drove all over Custer State Park. I drove out across the prairie. I drove up the side of the mountain. I drove around the back side of the mountain. And I couldn't find those buffalo. And I kept thinking, where do you hide 450 buffalo? That's how many they said were in this herd. And so finally on the third day, I came around this curve. And when I did, there they were, I guess all 450 of them. They were in this little ravine over here on the left. And one of them was about as close as from here to that door to my van. So I stopped the van. I put it in park. I grabbed the camcorder out of the back seat. I opened the door, I stepped out, and I started filming this real live buffalo. And here I am, I live back east by Chicago, and I'm in the Wild West, and I'm filming a real live buffalo, and I'm wearing my cowboy hat while I'm doing it, wearing my cowboy boots, and I'm thinking to myself, wow, this is really neat. And about that time, I noticed something went shh, right through the lens of my camera. It was kind of brown, and I thought, what was that? So I turned my camera, and this one buffalo had decided there was something on that side of the road that apparently he liked better than what was on that side of the road, because he ran across the road in front of my van. Now he's running out across the prairie. Now I'm filming a real live buffalo running across the prairie, mountains in the background, still wearing my cowboy hat, thinking to myself, this is the coolest thing that's ever happened. But about that time, I began to hear this rumble off to my left. And that rumble quickly became a roar. In fact, it was so loud, the only thing I could hear above that roar was this sweet little voice saying, get in the van, get in the van. And I'm thinking to myself, no way, I'm filming this, And sure enough, I got the whole thing on film. All 449 buffalo decided at the exact same moment, hey guys, there's something over there. And so they all decided to cross the road at the same moment. But the problem was my van was between them and the other side of the road. All 449 buffalo came right at my van, and when they got to it, they split and went right around both sides of it. I got the whole thing on film. I mean, it was just like an old John Wayne movie. Well, I never saw one, but Brother Dignan told me about it. And those buffalo went right past my van, and when they did, the ground was quaking underneath my feet. Now, I don't know if it was the buffalo making it quake or me making it quake, but the ground was quaking. And that's exactly what happened. These watchmen in the camp in Gibeah, they felt the ground quaking. So they ran out to the edge of the cliff, and they looked across the valley, and the Bible uses the phrase that they saw the enemy melting away, like a wave going back into the ocean. And it said as they did, they went on beating down one another. It was a stampede. They were trampling each other. And so the watchmen ran back to the center of the camp, and they said to Saul, they told Saul what was happening. He jumped up, grabbed his sword, said, "Come with me, guys." They take off across the valley. They begin to catch up with the enemy, and they started picking up the weapons that the enemy was dropping as they were trampling each other, and they started killing the enemy. Well, some of the Israeli soldiers that had gone AWOL had actually joined the Philistine army. When they saw that the Israelis were winning the battle, they turned around and rejoined the Israeli army and began to help kill the enemy. Word spread quickly that this was happening, and the other Israelis that were hiding in the caves and the thickets and so forth, they came back, they rejoined the army, and that day God gave the entire nation of Israel a great victory over their enemy, because there is no restraint with the Lord to save by many or by few. And one man believed that. His name was Jonathan. And that one man that believed that got one other man to go with him. And by the way, when I say he believed that, I don't mean he sat in the camp in Gibeah and said, God could give us the victory if he wanted to. If God decides to give us the victory, it's all up to him. No, when he said when I say he believed that, I don't mean it's just how he felt. I don't mean it's just what he thought. I mean it was what he was willing to do. You know, what you believe doesn't just determine how you feel. What you believe doesn't just determine what you think. What you believe determines what you do. Have you ever been to church on a Sunday morning and hear the preacher preach a good message? You know, one of those unusual ones that Brother Dignan preaches every once in a while. But have you ever walked out the back door on Sunday morning, and as you did, you shook the preacher's hand and said the same thing I've said before? Preacher, God really increased my faith this morning. But you know what we mean by that? What we mean is, I feel different now than when I got here. What we mean by that is, I'm thinking differently now than I was when I got here. We don't know if God increased our faith yet until we go out this week and see if we do more than we did last week. If God increased my faith, I'll pass out more tracts this week than I did last week. If God increased my faith, I'll invite more visitors this week than I did last week. If God increased my faith, I'll pray more this week than I did last week. If God increased my faith, I'll read my Bible more this week than I did last week. If God increased my faith, I'll do more this week than I did last week. Several years ago, many years ago now, there was a pastor in the country of Wales over by England. And this pastor had pastored a little church, a rural church, way out in the country. He'd been there about a year. And the deacon said to him one day, they said, "Pastor, we don't even know for sure if we ought to be doing this, but we just felt like that because you've been our pastor now for a year and we haven't had anybody saved yet, we thought we should ask you if you would be willing to at least pray about the possibility of maybe resigning our church, but because you've been our pastor now for a year and we haven't had anybody saved." And the pastor very humbly said, "Oh, I'm sure you're right. I should at least be willing to pray about it." He said, "Because you're right. I've been here a whole year. We haven't had anybody." He said, "Well, except for wee little Bobby Moffat." That's the phrase the pastor used, wee little Bobby Moffat. Little 8-year-old Bobby Moffat was the only person saved in that church that year. Bobby Moffat, he grew up to be a missionary in Africa. He spent his entire adult life on the continent of Africa. Bobby Moffat said near the end of his life that he felt like his life had been somewhat of a failure because he had been there his entire adult life and only a handful of people had gotten saved. So Bobby Moffat said, "I know what I'll do. I'll go back to England and I'll recruit several people to come to Africa. And if each one of them at least have a handful of people saved, maybe my life will account for something after all." So he went back to England. He began preaching a series of meetings. He started in London. He did a tour all around the United Kingdom. And about a year later, he was back in London preaching what became one of his last meetings. And not one single person had yet surrendered to go to Africa. That night, Bobby Moffat's adult daughter was in the service with her husband. About halfway through the service, she leaned over to her husband and she said, "I kind of feel sorry for Daddy, don't you?" And he said, "Yeah, I do." A moment later, she leaned over again and she said, "Why don't you and I go to Africa and take Daddy's place?" And he said, "Well, I guess I will if you will." And that night, David Livingstone surrendered to go to Africa. The greatest missionary that's ever lived. Because there is no restraint with the Lord to save by many or by few. In 1933, there was a pastor in a small town in southern Indiana, the town of Princeton, Indiana. At that time, there were about 7,000 people in Princeton. And this pastor got a burden that he wanted everybody in his town to know the gospel. But he knew he wasn't the kind of pastor that would ever get 7,000 people to come to church. In fact, he figured he would never get all 7,000 to come even one time. And so what he did was he sat down in his office one day, and as simply as he knew how, he just wrote out the plan of salvation. He took that to a typist and he asked her to type it. And then he took that to a printer and he asked him to print 2,000 copies. He thought there were about 2,000 houses in his village, his town at the time. And the printer said to the pastor, "Well, by the time I cut the template and get the ink flowing," are any of you willing to admit you're old enough to remember the old printing presses? Where you had to cut a template and you had to get the ink flowing before you could print something. And he said to the pastor, "By the time I do all that," he said, "I can run 10,000 copies just as easy as I can run 2,000. And he said, "Literally, it'll only cost you pennies more." He said, "So let me go ahead and run 10,000 copies. And the pastor said, "No, I know for sure I'll never need more than 2,000. He said, "So let's just run 2,000 copies. And so they did. They ran 2,000 copies. And he put one on every door in his town. And when he finished, he had about 200 left over. And what Dr. Ford Porter never dreamed of was that little plan he wrote out would become known as God's simple plan of salvation that has now been translated into 112 languages that we know of. And on the Ford Porter printing presses in Princeton, Indiana, they have printed over 602 million copies of this tract. And who knows how many more copies have been printed on other printing presses all around the world. But we do know this: millions have been saved. Because there is no restraint with the Lord to save by many or by few. Brother Dignan mentioned that he and I used to work in the bus ministry together when he was in college. And I honestly don't remember anything other than your pastor being a very good worker while he was there, a diligent worker in the bus ministry. But I remember there were some Sundays where we ran some extra buses. And on those special Sundays when we would run sometimes as many as 200 buses on the 155 bus routes that we worked with, we would sometimes bring as many as 10,000 people to church on a Sunday morning on those buses. On one of those special weekends, we were up on the north side of Chicago and we were visiting on Saturday trying to get extra people to come. And one of our lady workers by the name of Eileen met a little boy named Victorio Robles. Victorio Robles was 10 years of age. Victorio Robles had just moved to Chicago a few weeks before that from Mexico, so he didn't speak any English, and Eileen didn't speak much Spanish. But what little bit she knew, she got through to him, told him what she wanted. She went and talked to his mother, got permission for him to come on the bus. And Sunday morning, Victorio rode the bus, attended the junior church in our Spanish department. He walked the aisle and got saved and baptized that morning. He continued riding the buses until he graduated from high school. By the time he graduated from high school, he had been called to preach. And so Victorio wanted to go to Hyles-Anderson College and be a preacher boy. But the problem was, back then, Hyles-Anderson College didn't have all the legal papers to accept foreign students. And Victorio didn't have all the legal papers to be in America. And so we had to make some special arrangements, and we raised some money, and we helped Victorio get back to Mexico. And he went to Monterrey, Mexico, where Brother Tommy Ashcraft is a missionary there. And Brother Ashcraft has a Bible college, and Victorio enrolled in Bible college in Monterrey, Mexico. And to be honest with you, I kind of lost track of him. Until about 3 or 4 years ago, I was preaching in Mexico City for our graduate, Brother Kevin Wynn. Brother Kevin Wynn pastors a church that averages about 15,000 on Sunday morning. They run 50 buses every week. In fact, they run them 3 times a week, Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. And I found out when I was there that for the last 21 years, the bus director at Kevin Wynn's church has been Victoria Robles. And Victoria Robles has been responsible for 2.8 million people coming to church. And a little over 1 million of those people have walked an aisle on a Sunday morning in a public service, Sunday morning, Sunday night, or Wednesday night, and made a profession of faith in Christ. Because there is no restraint with the Lord. They're saved by many or by few. And you know that's true of that family that you're rearing for Christ. That's true of that junior choir that you oversee on Wednesday night. That's true of that Sunday school class that you teach. It's true of those few tracts that you pass out at work. It's true of those few visitors that you bring to church. It's true of those few converts that you win to Christ. It's true of those few children that ride your bus. It's true of those few dollars that you're able to give over and above your tithe in the offering. It's true of those few hours that you spend praying and asking God to bless your church and your pastor and to help people get saved. You know, it's true of anything you do for God. There is no restraint. They're saved by many or by few. Our former pastor, Dr. Jack Hiles, the man who started Hiles Anderson College, he pastored our church, the First Baptist Church of Hammond, for 41 years. During those 41 years, our church grew from an average attendance of 750 on Sunday morning to a little over 20,000 on Sunday morning. And during those 41 years, he started Hiles Anderson College. And now, like your pastor's doing such a great job pastoring here, there are over 1,000 men around the world pastoring churches that were trained at Hiles Anderson College. But our pastor, Dr. Jack Hiles, he grew up in a very poor neighborhood on the south side of Dallas. His father was a severe alcoholic. In fact, so severe he often lost his job from his drinking. And Brother Hiles used to laugh and say every time the rent came due, they had to move again. Because by the time he was 18 years of age and graduated from high school, they had lived in 17 different houses. And I don't understand all the psyche involved here, but for some reason, to that little Jackie Boy Hiles growing up in the home of that alcoholic in that poor neighborhood and in living in those 17 different houses, all those addresses became very important to him. They stuck in his brain. You might remember, and I know you folks would too, you remember when Brother Hiles would preach, he would often give illustrations about his childhood. And sometimes when he would give those illustrations, he would mention how old he was. When he was 12 years old, this happened, or when he was 8 years old, this happened. And occasionally, he would not only mention how old he was, he would give the address of where they lived at that particular time. And some of the folks are shaking their head, yes, they remember that. And I have no idea why, but for some reason, I got in the habit of every time he mentioned one of those addresses, I pulled out a card and I wrote it down. He not only mentioned the address of all 17 houses he lived in at one time or another, he mentioned the address of the grade school, the junior high, and the high school he went to. He mentioned the address of where he got what he called his first store-bought haircut in a barbershop. He mentioned the address of the church where he was saved, the one where he was called to preach, the one where he was married. And one time he even mentioned the address of the restaurant where he and Mrs. Hiles had their first date. And so I had this whole list, and I got an idea. And I went to Brother Hiles one day, and I said, Brother Hiles, I've got an idea. I said, I want to have a contest with my 155 bus captains, and the top 10 or 15 captains that bring the most visitors, I want to take them to Dallas, and I want to show them all these addresses. I said, what we'll do is we'll hear you preach on a Monday night, a Tuesday morning, and a Tuesday night in a conference, and when you fly home Wednesday morning to preach in our church, those bus captains and I will stay down there, and I'll show them all these addresses. I said, I think it'll be interesting to them. Well, Brother Hiles shocked me when he said, Ray, I'll beat that. He said, I'll stay down there with you on Wednesday morning and I'll show you those addresses. The only thing that shocked me more was when he got up in church the next Wednesday night and announced that God had given him an idea for a contest. And he called it the trip of a lifetime. A little play on words. He said, we're going to go to Dallas and we're going to see my lifetime. He said, but if you want to go on this trip, you'll have to win the contest this fall. He said, because we're just going to do this trip one time. It'll be the trip of a lifetime. And so we did the trip one time, 14 times in a row. Because he enjoyed it so much every time we did it. And every time we did the trip, we always stopped our bus on this one intersection on Fernwood Avenue. And we would get out of the bus and we would go into the yard of this little yellow 2-bedroom house, wood frame house on the northeast corner. And Brother Hiles would tell us several stories of things that happened to him as a little child when he lived in that house. Then we would walk catty-cornered across the street, and there was a greenhouse on the southwest corner, and we would stand in the yard there. And every time he told the story, he would look back at the yellow house and he would say, when we lost that house right there, and he would point at a window and he would say, we rented that room, not that house, that room right there from the Johnson family. And he said, my mom and dad slept on a blanket on the floor on that side of the room. Erlene, my sister, and me slept on a blanket on the other side. He said, we had one hot pot. He said, my mother fixed all of our meals on that hot pot in the middle of the floor. And then he would say, and you know, Brother Dignant, I never heard him tell this in a sermon, but he always told it on that trip. Every time he would say, now you folks know that I've told you many times, everywhere we lived, my mother always found a good church. And we always went to church. Now, my father never went with us, but my mother made sure I went to church everywhere we lived. Then he would say, except for about 3 months, while we lived right there in that room, we quit going to church. He said, because my mother got to the point to where she only owned one dress. And he'd say, right over there, she'd boil a big black pot full of water. She would take 2 buckets of water. She would go in that room. She'd pull the window shade down. She'd wash that dress in one bucket, rinse it in the other, wring it out, hang it up, let it drip dry, put it back on. And he said the dress became so faded and tattered and worn that my mother became embarrassed to wear the same dress to church every Sunday. So we quit going for 3 months until Mrs. Johnson figured out why they were not going to church. And he said Mrs. Johnson owned 3 dresses. He said, so Mrs. Johnson took one of her 3 dresses and gave it to my mother. And he said, my mother would save that hand-me-down dress that was better than the other one for Sundays. And every time he told the story, he would lean out from that house and he would look down the street 3 blocks to the Fernwood Avenue Baptist Church. And with tears running down his face, he would say, 2 weeks after Mrs. Johnson gave my mother that dress, little 11-year-old Jackie Boy Hiles got saved on a Sunday night at the Fernwood Avenue Baptist Church. Because there is no restraint. Hey, can you imagine how many rewards in heaven Mrs. Johnson, not Jack Hiles, Mrs. Johnson is going to receive for one dress? Because there's no restraint with the Lord. The saved by many or by few.